Nobody tells you this about discipline. They sell you the dream. Wake up early, stay focused, build routines, work harder than everyone else. And they promise that if you stay disciplined, your life will become better. What they don't tell you is what happens after. Because the more disciplined you become, the quieter your world gets. The people you used to laugh with start feeling distant. The conversations that once entertained you begin to feel painfully empty. The things that once gave you comfort stop satisfying you. And one day, you look around and realize, the path of self-mastery is also the path of isolation. But here's the question nobody asks. What if loneliness isn't the side effect of discipline? What if it's the test that proves your transformation is real? And to understand that, we need to understand what discipline actually does to a person. Discipline rewires who you are. Most people think discipline is about forcing yourself to do hard things, waking up at 5 a.m., going to the gym, deleting distractions, staying consistent. But real discipline goes much deeper than behavior. It rewires identity. At first, discipline feels like resistance. You force yourself to say no to what feels good right now for something greater later. But over time, that resistance becomes instinct. You no longer crave chaos. You stop needing constant stimulation. You stop chasing the dopamine hits that most people structure their entire lives around. And this is where everything changes, because most social connection today is built around distraction. Scrolling together, complaining together, escaping together. People bond through avoidance of discomfort, avoidance of silence, avoidance of themselves. But discipline removes your need to escape. And when you stop participating in that cycle, you naturally begin separating from the people still trapped inside it. Not because you think you're better, but because you're becoming different. And that difference creates distance. But this is where it gets uncomfortable. Because once your identity changes, people around you start noticing. And their reaction is rarely what you expect. Why does your growth make some people uncomfortable? Because discipline does something dangerous. It forces others to confront themselves. Why people get uncomfortable around disciplined people? Disciplined people often make average people uncomfortable. Not because they're arrogant, not because they think they're better, but because discipline acts like a mirror, and mirrors force reflection. Your self-control reminds people of their impulses. Your focus reminds them of their excuses. Your consistency reminds them of the promises they broke to themselves. And that creates discomfort. Because most people spend their lives avoiding self-confrontation. That's why your ambition gets mocked. You're doing too much. That's why your routines get questioned. Why are you so obsessed? That's why your growth gets misunderstood. You've changed. But what they're really saying is, your discipline is making them uncomfortable with their lack of it. Psychologically, this is called cognitive dissonance. When your actions contradict someone's beliefs about themselves, it creates internal tension. And instead of changing, many people choose a simpler solution. They criticize the person exposing the contradiction. That person becomes you. Not because you attacked them, but because your existence reminds them of the standards they abandoned. And once you understand this, you stop taking resistance personally. Because their discomfort was never about you. It was about what your transformation reveals. And slowly, you begin to realize something painful. Growth doesn't just elevate you, it separates you. And that separation leads to something almost every disciplined person experiences. A loneliness no one prepares you for. The silent loneliness of self-improvement. The motivational quotes. The transformation stories. The visible success. But what people rarely show is the silence. The long hours alone. The moments of doubt. The nights when no one understands what you are building. Because real growth is deeply lonely. You spend more time by yourself. You begin outgrowing friendships that once felt permanent. You stop relating to conversations centered around distraction, gossip, and comfort. And slowly, you realize something painful. Most people do not actually want freedom. They want comfort disguised as freedom. They want escape, ease, distraction. And this is where loneliness begins. Not because no one is physically around you, but because fewer and fewer people understand the way your mind now works. You are surrounded by people, yet mentally somewhere else entirely. And eventually, this loneliness forces one of the hardest realizations of all. Growth changes relationships, sometimes permanently. The pain of outgrowing people. One of the most painful truths about growth is realizing not everyone can come with you. Some people only connected with the old version of you, the version that was easier to predict, easier to influence, easier to keep small, the comfortable version, the distracted version, the version that didn't challenge their own choices simply by existing. But discipline changes social dynamics. The moment you become more intentional, you unintentionally expose those who refuse to evolve. And often, friendships don't end with conflict. They simply fade. Quietly. Without explanation. Without closure. Not because of hate, but because your paths no longer align. And accepting this is one of the most emotionally difficult parts of becoming who you're meant to become. But what feels like loss at first often becomes transformation, because isolation carries a hidden power. One most people never discover. Why isolation creates strength. Isolation can destroy the undisciplined, but it can transform the focused. Because silence reveals who you truly are, without noise, without validation, without applause. There is nowhere left to hide. And that confrontation changes everything. In solitude, you meet your fears, your excuses, your insecurities, your weaknesses. And most people spend their entire lives running from that meeting. That's why disciplined people become mentally stronger. They learn to exist without constant stimulation, without approval, without attention. They become emotionally self-sufficient. And emotional independence is one of the rarest forms of power in the modern world. Because a person who no longer needs external validation cannot easily be controlled. And eventually, something extraordinary happens. The truth disciplined people eventually discover. The thing you once feared most becomes the very thing that sets you free. The final realization. You stop fearing loneliness because you finally understand what it gave you. Clarity, focus, freedom. You realize loneliness was never the punishment. Staying average was. Discipline teaches a truth few people ever fully accept. You do not need a crowd to build a meaningful life. You need purpose, direction, control over yourself. And once you experience the peace that comes from alignment, temporary loneliness no longer scares you, because your future becomes more important than social comfort. And that is the moment discipline becomes liberation. Not restriction, not sacrifice, liberation. Which leads to the hidden truth most people will never understand. The one lesson discipline quietly teaches everyone who endures it. Discipline doesn't just build success, it changes who you can relate to forever. It changes what excites you, what matters to you, what no longer satisfies you. And maybe that's the darkest truth of all. Growth will often separate you from the life you once knew. But sometimes, that separation is exactly what makes transformation possible. Because the strongest people are not the ones surrounded by everyone. They are the ones strong enough to walk alone until they become who they were meant to be. The question is, will you return to comfort or continue to be the person you were meant to be. If you want to grow and become the best version of yourself, then maintain discipline. If you're ready, comment below. Growth requires solitude.